A Ghosting of Byrds by S. E. Smith. From the casebook of Symington, Earl Byrd, Mayfair, December 25th, 1900. For as long as I have been master of my destiny, Christmas in the Byrd household has been a time of great merriment and cheer, everyone mucking in together to create an atmosphere that even a Puritan would find hard to criticise. From Christmas Eve to Twelfth Night, everyone cooked together, ate together, laughed and cried together. The door was always open to guests, not just my immediate kin or that of my staff. Not that Watkins had any family. Orphaned at an early age, I dared not think what his life was like before I encountered his sorry hide in the heat of India. But Imran and Samson did, and sometimes when my cook's family came over from India, they too joined us. A cousin was staying with us that year, and was happily talking to Samson's maiden aunt about this and that, and that and this, neither pausing for breath nor really listening to what the other had to say in reply. But they were happy, and Samson ensured their glasses were filled with the tipple of choice. In his younger days, even Edward, Prince of Wales, had been known to pop by for a small libation. He'd even been known to take turns with a tea towel. Not now, of course. Her Majesty's days were numbered, far too soon for his liking. For all he complained she kept him waiting. He would assume the mantle of command. Turning my attention away from the sudden morbidity of my thoughts, I looked around my Mayfair apartment. As always, the place was brightly decorated with everything Bertie's late father would find appropriate. Boughs of holly decked the halls, cards from all and sundry littered every available space. Mistletoe hung invitingly above the door to the outside world, whilst presents of all shapes and sizes were arranged under the huge fir tree which dominated the sitting room. Beneath lay the presents we wouldn't open till Boxing Day. Some addressed, others a lucky dip suitable to give to any and all who crossed my threshold. The ghost of Christmases past and present would be delighted, and my chains of sin would grow no longer. Yet, for all the gaiety, I felt this Christmas to be somewhat lacking and flat. A case I'd been working on dragged through autumn and only just reached its conclusion 2 days ago, which left us in a bit of a rush to be ready for the rest of my Christmas guests. Imran and Samson, my chef and valet, were unflappable. How they did it, I do not know, but turkeys and other fowl hung in our larder. Ham hocks were cloved ready for boiling, whilst potatoes and other sundry trimmings rested in water, prepped and ready to go. Fortunately for the smooth running of events, I'd been banned from working in the kitchen. Last year, a slight contretemps over the basting of the turkey had led to Imran declaring I was a sad and hopeless case, and incapable of being trusted with anything. Truth be told, I was glad to be relegated to the role of host. I miss my companion of recent months, a vibrant and forthright young lady who challenged my heart and mind and made me feel more alive than I had for a long time. Unable to help myself, these last few days had seen me prone to melancholy, a state of affairs quickly, if not perfectly, rectified by being forced to be jolly. It was just what the doctor had ordered, or would have been if I had bothered to seek advice from one of that august body. So I stood there, togged up to the nines, ready to answer the door, while Samson and Imran chefed, and Watkins, my driver, readied the room for the free-for-all that was my adult response to the all-too-dreary and formal Yuletide affairs my cousin Cece and I had been forced to endure with grandfather. As always, Christmas morning brought Cece and his brood to my door. Bounding in shortly after the obligatory church visit, they filled the apartment with noise and bustle and joy and laughter. His 4 children were a lively bunch, though, as you would expect from having a policeman for a father, they were well-behaved urchins, polite to a fault. Their mother was a very different kettle of fish. I never warmed to Violet, and I'm glad to say she never warmed to me, but we kept a pleasantish truce. I offered her a drink. She took it with a murmur of practised thanks, but her eye was inexorably drawn to the tinsel. "Is that real silver?" she demanded, as she examined the metal strands with their holly-shaped leaves and little rose-gold berries. Samson, who always took longer to relax into the holiday spirit than the rest of us, materialized at her side. "It is indeed, Mrs. Carter, a present from a jeweller acquaintance of his lordship. Thanks for a job well done, I believe." He placed a dish of Imran's finest confectionery at her side before hunkering down before my youngest niece, a blonde, curly-haired child of 5, far too grown up for her age. I don't know what they said. The conversation was too quiet to catch. All I could gather, given Samson's responses and the way Amelia stared at me through increasingly narrowed and cynical eyes, that my niece saw through my forced jocularity. I hoped whatever Samson told her would ease her pain. She saw me as her favourite uncle, a man famous for his good cheer and bonhomie. I didn't want her to learn that I had scorpions dancing tarantellas in my head, just like her father, just like her mother. I looked for Cece, but couldn't find him amidst the throng. I smiled. It wasn't really surprising. Christmas heaven for my cousin was a 3-part affair. Time spent with his children, time spent cooking in Imran's kitchen, and a never-ending supply of fudge. "Swirl us around, Uncle Symington." As always, the twins, mirrors in more than looks, demanded in unison. I shook my head. "You're getting far too big for such things." Normally, they would have preened. No 7-year-old likes being thought of as small. But alas, this year it was true. "One last time, Uncle Symington," Graham, the elder of the pair, begged. "One last time." "Come now, don't pester your uncle. He's correct. You're too big for such things," Violet ordered from the touchline. "Oh, please, Mamma, please." Sensing tantrums were near, I waded into the fray. "Now, boys, you know the rules. Mothers are always right." Frowns replaced tantrums. "Fortunately, I've been talking with His Royal Highness, and he's told me about this smashing new game that's all the rage with the royal family, one we can play for years to come, and it does involve swirling." Cheers replaced downturned mouths. Violet huffed. I suppressed a grin of victory. I mean, who could contradict the diktats of the future King of England, especially as that personage had a habit of dropping in at some point during the festivities? He wouldn't this year, of course. But Violet didn't need to know. Watkins, preternaturally anticipating the danger of our activity, had cleared ornaments from tables, and was, even now, standing in front of the fire wearing a face that told me stranger things had been known to happen. But Watkins and his forebodings were soon forgotten, as childish squeals of delight took my mind off the worries of adulthood. Clapping in time to the swirling, Imran grinned and swayed rhythmically to our dancing. I grinned back, and he laughed, jerking a thumb behind him to show my cousin's destination. Imran, it seemed, handed over the reins of the kitchen earlier than usual, no doubt because dancing was his favourite pastime. Imran's hoots and cries transported me briefly to India and our first meeting. A regimental ball. I'd been dancing with a lovely young lady who did not deserve her fate. He had been accused of her murder when she had been found face down at the bottom of the stairs, her body all unnatural angles. I'd cleared him. He claimed he owed me his life, came back with me to England. Momentarily thrown off kilter, I stumbled. Fortunately, thinking it part of the game, Graham and Simon increased their cries of delight, and, caught up in their infectious joy, I returned to the present. By 7, with dinner consumed and gifts shared, we reached that companionable part of the evening where the children clamoured for one of my famous Christmas stories. In bygone years, I always gave the matter due consideration in the run-up to the festive season, and prepared myself accordingly. This year, my mind had been preoccupied, and whilst I knew the request waited like a spectre, it was something of a shock to hear it voiced so soon after the plum pudding was removed. A tug on my coat found me looking directly into the angular face of Susan, 11.5, and already taller than Imran. The eldest of the Carter brood bore herself with all the dignity of the Byrds. Except she was not tugging my coat. That task fell to Amelia and her pudding-coated fingers. Samson winced. I laughed and ruffled her hair. "Oh, please, Uncle Symington, please!" Always a sucker, as our American cousins would say, for the pleadings of small children, I roused myself from the semi-lethargy always caused by too many Brussels, and, with a look of overdone sadness, declared, "I have nothing prepared, no story to tell." 4 children and the collected adults groaned. "Oh, please, Uncle Symington," they repeated, "you've got to tell us a story. It wouldn't be Christmas without one." Overplaying the panic-stricken uncle for all it was worth, I spun around the room. But I was devoid of allies. Cece, happily snaffling fudge, wore paternal pride like a robin shows off its red breast at the first sign of winter. Violet smiled contentedly, her eyes fixed on the hand still clasping my best evening coat. I gathered from her beatific expression that she relished the thought of my forthcoming altercation with Samson. She would be no help either. Desperation made me search the faces of my staff. Imran, choosing as always to sit on the floor, sipped his lassie with obvious enjoyment. "Imran, can't you help?" I asked brightly. Usually the font of good stories in life in the wilds of India, he was more than ready to share them. But to my horror, he shook his head. "No, Major. I've nothing suitable for Christmas time. Not my festival." My cook grinned. Watkins laughed. The children's chorus grew, louder, more persistent. It deafened me into defeat. Yet, unwilling to concede too soon, I became the master of ceremonies, adopting the full razzmatazz of the music hall compere, milking the crowd participation for all it was worth. Then, just before it tipped from entreaty into riot, I held out my hand, and silence fell. "Help me out here, please, chaps." One by one, my guests shook their heads. I was hung out to dry good and proper, stitched like a kipper, until reaching the still form of my driver, I knew I didn't need to look any further. His eyes implored, beseeched. There was only one story he wanted told, exorcised if you like, so he could forget that strange night and move on. "No, Watkins," I said gruffly, "no, it's not a suitable story for Christmas." Unaccountable shivers traversed their way up and down my spine. I was transported back to that night long ago. I did not want to be there again. It was too phantasmagorical, too wild. "Oh, come on, Gov. It's a perfect story for Christmas. Food, good company, a ghost story. What more do you want?" His voice might be jocular. His face most certainly was not. "Besides, it's not like they're babes anymore," he said as I shook my head a second time. But the music hall audience saw their cue and took it. "We're not babies, Uncle Symington. You can tell us anything. I'm 12 in May. I can read now, Uncle. I helped in the kitchen. I basted," another added, adding the following insult to the never-ending barrage. "That means I'm more mature than you are. You're not allowed to do that." And so on. I was being picked on, and I loved it. Bah humbug! I modelled my performance on a man I'd met recently, a man whose name inspired fear, a man my cousin hated with a passion. But to my surprise, my impersonation brought a genuine bark of laughter, and more entreaties from the children. A good commanding officer knows when to retreat, and I like to think I was more than a good commanding officer. I sighed dramatically. "Oh, very well," I huffed, and while the children cheered, I turned to Watkins, wagging a solemn finger in his direction. "If I hear they have nightmares, Watkins, you are fired." Grinning unrepentantly, my driver did no more than move my chair into the centre of the room. Children sprawled at my feet, heads propped on triangular arms. Imran, crossing his legs, reminding me of a gnome, albeit a scrawny one, sat next to them, far away enough to give them the sense they were being trusted, near enough to stop unwarranted scraps and contretemps. Samson, who always loved a good story, especially one at my expense, put down his cards and turned to me, his eyes wide O's of excitement. Cece and his wife worked in harmony to recharge everyone's glasses, and I was glad that for a moment they too were caught up in the spirit of Christmas. Repressing a sigh which may or may not have been entirely for the children's benefit, I waited until Cece and Violet were settled before I coughed to bring things to order, and into the ensuing silence I began. When I first came back to England, I said, before your mother and father had you chaps, Samson, Watkins and I would travel up to Wales to spend Christmas with grandfather in the house he kept near Snowdon. Usually we'd go up by train, and grandfather would send a carriage to pick us up from Porthmadog station. But in the year my story is set, Mr. Samson was holidaying with his Aunt Sophia. I bowed to the old lady, and she grinned delighted at me, glad to be part of the tale. I smiled back. So Watkins and I took up my Jacquard steam car and, bundled up against the cold, for as you know she was open to the elements and deuced uncomfortable, made a leisurely way up from the smoke to the wilds of Wales. I stayed with friends for a couple of nights in Chester, and had not duty, and a telegram from grandfather called me. Both Watkins and I could quite happily have stayed in that lovely city. I paused and looked at Watkins before lowering my voice to a conspiratorial level. You see, Watkins met a lady and was becoming enamoured. And as you know, I do not like to stand in the way of true love. My nieces sighed dramatically. Graham and his brother, both at that age, looked sick at the mention of girls as anything other than sisters. Cece raised a warning brow. I laughed. Do not worry, cousin of mine. I don't intend to be that indiscreet. I leaned in to the children and put my index finger to my lip, a time-honoured gesture of secret whisperings. I only tell you this because grandfather's telegram meant that Watkins had to leave his lady-love, and that put him in a foul mood. Giggles accompanied my pronouncement, especially when Watkins, ever one to pick up an accue, added, I still ain't forgiven you, Gov. She was a lovely girl. I put up my hand and, in best parade ground bark, said, Watkins, may I remind you, you wanted me to tell this story, so I'm telling it my way, without interruptions. Watkins plastered a suitably contrite expression to his face and muttered something which caused Cece to laugh and Violet to stare at her children in concern. Fortunately, they knew Watkins well enough to know he wasn't serious about his plans for me, and, after throwing a glare in his direction, I continued. It was a horrible night, I told them. Snow threatened, and the temperature outside the Jacquot 1878 plummeted as we turned our back on the Clwydian range and headed for the real mountains of Wales. Watkins was a morose and full of complaint about the roads, the weather, the lack of visibility. Even the latest election results were subject to his incessant and sometimes insightful opinions. Not that I listened, for as you know, children, it does not do to give communism the courtesy of showing it's worth consideration. Besides, I knew the reason for his frostiness, and felt his pain. As we turned onto the Bangor road, the snow finally got its act together. Slow and gentle at first, it soon became insidious, murderous even. Yet, with the snow came blessed silence. Watkins, too good a driver to be careless, gave the road his full consideration. But I noticed by the way he overreacted to every twist and turn the road threw at us that he was rattled. It seemed he needed the distraction of our continued row to ensure we made our destination not that far away now. I was only too happy to oblige. Watkins, am I to take this silence as an indication of your impending resignation? My tone was cool, almost as arctic as the conditions around us. Watkins threw doubt on my parentage. I refuse to apologise any further, Watkins. It was not my fault. You could have sent a telegram back telling His Grace the weather was too bad. God knows he would have accepted that as reason for not going to see him. If I'd been a man of Watkins's vocabulary, I would have told him in no uncertain terms that hell would have frozen over before grandfather accepted a bally word I said. As it was, I decided to move on to something even more contentious. Turn the Jacquot's engine off before you topple her over with your carelessness and your sedition. I've had enough of this. You, sir, are an atheist, a communist and a Republican. Stop making out otherwise with your words. Watkins snorted. Make me, capitalist pig. I know what I know. This weather is proper brass monkeys. I refused to answer. Anyhow, you're going to be the one stranded out in the wilds of wherever we are when I pull over, not me. You ain't wearing the shoes for it. My well-manicured eyebrows raised a reply as I realised he'd fallen for my ploy. I will not be walking. Pardon? Watkins' response was a brilliant impersonation of my own dulcet tones, and I was hard-pressed not to laugh while waiting for him to navigate a particularly nasty bend before repeating my assertion. Watkins grinned broadly. You will? It ain't your steam car, Gov. Impossible. As I knew he would, Watkins warmed to his theme. You lost this beautiful brass and wooden lady to me in a game of cards. Poker. I did. A pause. A manufactured oh my God moment followed by a you can't hold a man to what he does when he's drunk. Don't try welshing out of it. I won it, fair and square. Even got old sober-side Samson to witness your signature, so you wouldn't do anything capitalist. Like Welsh out of a deal. I held the silence for a while, making it appear that I was too busy thinking about that night, even though I already knew what I was going to say. Watkins, if I lost this car to you, why am I still paying for its upkeep? Grin became chortle. He only ever did that when amusement was too much. Because, Gov, it is the duty of every self-respecting worker to stuff the capitalist bastards at every opportunity. After that exchange, my driver relaxed, which was good because the night became darker and the weather fouler, and still there was no sign of an inn where we could rest our weary bottoms. Snow swooped in and up on us, like a revolutionary mob conjured by Watkins' Marxist maxims. For every further yard we drove, death's grisly spectre haunted us until, unnerved beyond belief, I put an end to our travels. We need to stop. We need to stop, I shouted, as a fearsomely evil Arctic blast nearly turned us over. For God's sake, man, pull over and we'll share this blanket until the brouhaha is over. Well, that's an offer I don't get every day, Gov, he said on a laugh. And while you're not as pretty as that piece in Chester, the weather is rotten. He stopped the engine and, without turning, pointed to our left. But if you don't mind, I'd rather go and see what that light is. Following the direction of his arm, I squinted for a moment, unable to see what had got him all excited. Then I saw it, a twinkling brightness in the dear distance below. Won't be long, Gov, Watkins said briskly as he alighted. Hopefully it'll be somewhere we can stay. Bit more warm and welcoming than out here catching our deaths. Nonsense. I'm not having you catch your death of cold and using it as an excuse to haunt me for all eternity. We'll go together. But your shoes. What will old Soberside say? Bloody hell, Corporal. If I can survive barefoot in the Himalayas, I'm sure my shoes can survive Welsh snow. I think he cast doubts on my parentage again. I'm not sure. I was too busy laughing. But I wasn't laughing when it became obvious that we'd have to go down a snowy bank to the source of the light. Want me to go first, Gov? Watkins shouted from behind. For a change, I threw doubts on his parentage, and putting my best foot forward, slid down the bank, grateful the road below was nearer than it originally appeared. Bickering to keep our minds off the cold, I sang Good King Wenceslas both parts, while Watkins muttered, "Come the revolution, you parasite's going to be living in a one-room hovel, relying on handouts from the state." I paused mid-mark my footsteps. "Suppose you'll be the ones handing out largesse to the parasites?" "Course, Gov. I'm a hard-working worker." I snorted and resumed my singing. And by the end we reached habitation. "Where the devil are we?" I asked, as the snow stopped long enough for me to make out a sign on the side of the road. I scampered and slid my way to it, then, rubbing the snow from it, read the legend, LLaydes Ddansien. I stepped back, confusion marring my snow-drenched features, and turned in time to see Watkins frown deeply. "Never heard of it, Gov." He shrugged, then rallied. "Mind you, there's loads of places in the world. Stands to reason we can't heard of all of 'em." His logic, as always, was impeccable. I had not heard of it either, and I had grown up in these woods and hills. A shiver assailed me, working its way from my shoulders to my toes, unnerving me deeply. A heavily muffled scorpion awoke, danced on ice skates through my mind, warning me to turn back, go no further. But I, poor fool that I am, ignored it. Stepping out onto the path by the side of the village sign, I noticed 9, maybe 10 houses ranged out in strip formation down a single-track road. From the way the wind and snow flurried around, we were at the bottom of a valley, at its narrowest part. Smoke swirled in the air. It should have given the village a homely feel, but it did not. The only light came from the last but one house on the street. The rest of the houses were boarded tight as if waiting for an oncoming storm, rather than waiting like an impatient child for the arrival of Father Christmas and his sled. Sighing, Page and Monarch headed down the road until we reached the double-fronted place. Larger than the other cottages, it was jolly, full of the smells of Christmas that I slowly realised were absent from every other house. A holly wreath, bedraggled and clearly last year's reused, hung from a nail on the front door. But rather than knock immediately, I went to look through the window, just to gauge the depths of our invasion. From encrusted windows, I could just about make out a Christmas tree festooned with candles. Paper chains hung between the beams, and on the mantel, oranges stuffed with clothes no doubt gave off the unmistakable scent of Christmas. Curtains, chintzy and welcoming, watched us from the windows of the ground floor, and as I pressed myself nearer to the scene, beyond, the smells of burning wood and goose beckoned us, like Hansel and Gretel to a less grisly fate. "How good's your Welsh, Watkins?" I asked, as I walked back to the door and lifted my fist to rap out a bright and obviously friendly tattoo. "Why, Gov?" "We're in Gwynedd, Watkins." Horror drained him of expression. "They speak the Cymraeg, not the Saesneg here." "Bloody hell, Gov! You know I don't do languages." I laughed. I knew all right. Watkins spoke Welsh with the same fluency he spoke French. "English," shouted carefully. I left him to his mutterings and knocked again. Still no response. So I barked a view halloo and waited. Behind me, Watkins hugged himself theatrically. Except I realised it wasn't a show. Cold white breath and chattering teeth completed the image of a man fallen from comfort. He was, I realised suddenly, soaked to the skin. Manners forgotten, I barged the door. Immediately it gave way, and I laughed. Silly bird. Should have expected nothing less. This is Wales, after all. There is no need to lock our doors. I called again as we shut the door behind us, and yet again there was no reply. Water, possibly from my scarf, splashed my face, and never being one to like an unintentional dousing, I rubbed frantically at my eyes. Watkins snorted his laughter, and forgetting I was a peer of the realm and a retired army officer, I stuck my tongue out and headed down the small passageway to the room I'd spied earlier. It was a strange place, this cottage of ours. Not a collier or slater's gaff, this was the home of an educated sort. Cluttered, too, and I suddenly found myself thinking of great expectations. This was everything I imagined as I read about the Pockets house. Every available surface piled high with books and pictures, knick-knacks and displays of taxidermy. I opened the door into the main room. A map of Africa, the victim of water stains, held pride of place above a slate-mantled fireplace. The fire was at that pleasing stage where a man could toast bread or himself in comfort. The rest of the room was grand, in places ostentatious. Rich reds and giltwork indicated this was an overtly middle-class home, whose occupants would never need visitations from ghosts to remind them of their need for charity and goodwill towards their fellow man. By the side of one of the faded, well-mended leather chairs stood a rickety table piled high with the copies of the Times and scientific journals. It distinguished balance to perfection, like a precarious puppy growing into paws. One false move, and it would tumble down. I left Watkins warming by the fire and went in search of the owner of such a wonderful Alice in Wonderland world. Perhaps the occupiers were upstairs, a forgetful pair, old before their time. Then I remembered the fire. No matter how forgetful, no one left a fire unattended. They had to be out back somewhere, but it was strange I hadn't seen them. My foot stopped mid-step, determined suddenly to venture no further. I had a strange sensation that not only was I intruding, I was being watched. I turned, and as I did so, I saw it. A little, insignificant thing, easily overlooked. A cup on the floor, smashed to smithereens. I bent down, crouching on my heels, hand outstretched to test the warmth of what little contents remained. I never completed my investigation. A blood-curdling scream froze me.